usage and style was a hallmark of the Middle and early modern English periods. Chaucer sometimes used doctrine for the plural of daughters, and sometimes doctres, sometimes year, and sometimes yeres. Like other writers of the period, he assumed the subtle on whichever form first popped into his head, even at the risk of being inconsistent from one paragraph to the next. But I must quickly interject, the problem with interpreting Chaucer is that none of his original manuscripts survive. Everything we have of his was copied by medieval scribes, who sometimes took extraordinary liberties with the text, seeing themselves more as editors than as copyists. At the same time, they were often strikingly careless. For example, the Clerk's Tale contains the line, "There stood a through both sight delectable," but in various manuscripts, sight is rendered as sight, S-I-G-H-T-E, scythe, sigh, and sight, C-I-T-E. It is impossible at this remove to know which was the word Chaucer intended. Literally scores of such confusions and inconsistencies clutter the manuscripts of most poets of the age, which makes an analysis of changes in the language problematic. It is often noted that Chaucer's spelling was wildly inconsistent. Cunt, if you will forgive an excursion into crudity, as we so often must when dealing with Chaucer, is spelled at least 5 ways, ranging from K-E-N-T to Q-U-A-I-N-T-E. So it isn't possible to say whether the inconsistency lies with Chaucer or his copyists or both. Other forms, such as plural pronouns, had yet to settle. Chaucer used he, him, and her for they, them, and their. Her for their survived up to the time of Shakespeare, who used it at least twice in his plays. Similarly, his, where we now use its, was the usual form until about 1600, which is why the King James Bible is full of constructions like, "If the salt has lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted?" Similarly, which was until about the same time used of animate things as well as inanimate, as in the form of the Lord's Prayer still used in England, "Our Father, which art in heaven." In Old English, there were at least 6 endings that denoted plurals, but by Shakespeare's time these had by and large shrunk to 2, S and EN. But even then the process was nowhere near complete. In the Elizabethan age, people sometimes said shoes and sometimes shoen, sometimes house and sometimes housen. It is interesting to reflect that had the seat of government stayed in Winchester, rather than moved the 60 miles or so to London, we would today very probably be talking of 6 housen and a pair of shoen. Today there are just 3 of these old weak plurals, children, brethren, and oxen. However, even though S or ES after an SH spelling has become the standard form for plurals, there are still traces of the complex Old English system lurking in the language in plurals such as men, women, feet, geese, and teeth. Similarly, verbs have undergone a long and erratic process of regularization. Chaucer could choose between ached and oak, climbed and clomb, clew or clawed, shaved and shove. In Shakespeare's time, forgat and digged were legitimate past tenses. In fact, until well into the 17th century, digged was the more common, as in Shakespeare's "Two kinsmen digged their grave with weeping." As recently as 1751, Thomas Gray's famous poem was published as "Elegy Wrote in a Country Churchyard." 70 years later, the poet John Keats could write, "Let my epitaph be, here lies one whose name was writ on water." So the invariable pattern we use today, write, wrote, written, is really quite recent. The common pattern in these changes was for the weak verbs to drive out the strong ones, but sometimes it worked the other way, so that today we have torn instead of teared, and knew rather than knowed. Many of these have become regularized, but there are still 250 irregular verbs in English, and a surprising number of these are still fluid, so that even now most of us are not always sure whether we should say dived or dove, sneaked or snuck, hove or heaved, wove or weaved, strived or strove, swelled or swollen. Other words underwent changes, particularly those beginning with N, where there was a tendency for this letter to drift away from the word and attach itself to the preceding indefinite article. The process is called meta-analysis. Thus, a napron became an apron, a nogger became an auger, and an ekaname became, over time, a nickname. By a similar process, the nicknames Ned, Nell, and Nan are thought to be corruptions of mine Edward, mine Ellen, and mine Anne, cited by Barber, page 183. But there were losses along the way. Today we have two demonstrative pronouns, this and that. But in Shakespeare's day there was a third, yon, as in the Milton line, him that yon soars on golden wing, which suggested a further distance than that. You could talk about this hat, that hat, and yon hat. Today the word survives as a colloquial adjective, yonder, but our speech is fractionally impoverished for its loss. Similarly, Shakespeare in The Two Gentlemen of Verona was able to make a distinction between hair and hairs that is effectively lost to us today when he wrote, "She hath more hair than wit, and more faults than hairs." Other languages possess even further degrees of thatness. As Pei notes, the Cree Indian language has a special that for things just gone out of sight, while Ilocano, a tongue of the Philippines, has three words for this referring to a visible object, a fourth for things not in view, and a fifth for things that no longer exist. Pei, The Story of Language, page 128. Some of the changes since Shakespeare's time are obvious. Thee and thou had already begun a long decline, though they still exist in some dialects of northern England. Originally, thou was to you as the French tu is to vous. Thou signified either close familiarity or social inferiority, while you was the more impersonal and general term. In European languages to this day, choosing between the two forms can present a very real social agony. As Jespersen, a Dane who appreciated these things, put it, English has thus attained the only manner of address worthy of a nation that respects the elementary rights of each individual. The growth and structure of the English language, page 251. The changing structure of English allowed writers the freedom to express themselves in ways that had never existed before, and none took up this opportunity more liberally than Shakespeare, who happily and variously used nouns as verbs, as adverbs, as substantives, and as adjectives, often in ways they had never been employed before. He even used adverbs as adjectives, as with that dastardly rogue in Henry IV, a construction that must have seemed as novel then as it does now. He created expressions that could not grammatically have existed previously, such as breathing one's last and backing a horse. No one in any tongue has ever made greater play of his language. He coined some 2,000 words, an astonishing number, and gave us countless phrases. As a phrasemaker, there has never been anyone to match him. Among his inventions, one fell swoop, in my mind's eye, more in sorrow than in anger, to be in a pickle, bag and baggage, vanish into thin air, budge an inch, play fast and loose, go down the primrose path, the milk of human kindness, remembrance of things past, the sound and the fury, to thine own self be true, to be or not to be, cold comfort, to beggar all description, salad days, flesh and blood, foul play, tower of strength, to be cruel, to be kind, and on and on and on and on. And mildly prolific that he could put two catchphrases in one sentence, as in Hamlet's observation, "Though I am native here and to the manner born, it is a custom more honored in the breach than the observance." He could even mix metaphors and get away with it, as when he wrote, "Or to take arms against a sea of troubles. It is terrifying to think that had not two faithful followers, the actors John Hemming and Henry Condell, taken the considerable trouble of assembling an anthology of his work, the famous First Folio, in 1623, 7 years after his death, 16 of his plays would very probably have been lost to us forever. As it is, two have been, Cardenio and Love's Labour's Won. Not a single Shakespeare manuscript survives, so, as with Chaucer, we cannot be sure how closely the work we know is really Shakespeare's. Hemming and Condell consulted any number of sources to produce their folio, printers' manuscripts, actors' prompt books, even the memories of other actors. But from what happened to the work of other authors, it is probable that they have been changed a lot. One of Shakespeare's publishers was Richard Field, and it is known from extant manuscripts that when Field published the work of the poet John Harrington, he made more than 1,000 changes to the spelling and phrasing. It is unlikely that he did less with Shakespeare, particularly since Shakespeare himself seemed singularly unconcerned with what became of his work after his death. As far as is known, he did not bother to save any of his poems and plays, a fact that is sometimes taken as evidence that he didn't write them. There have been many other more subtle changes in English since Shakespeare's day. One has been the rise of the progressive verb form, where we would say, "What are you reading?" Shakespeare could only say, "What do you read?" He would have had difficulty expressing the distinctions contained in "I am going," "I was going," "I have been going," and "I will or shall be going." The passive progressive construction, as in "the house is being built," was quite unknown to him. Yet it goes without saying that this scarcely slowed him down. Even in its greatest flowering, English is still considered in many respects a second-rate language, newly invidious.
Stand-up shopping is pretty awesome, but don't take our word for it. Just ask for members. Save time and skip the checkout line, which we hear is the best thing ever. See for yourself. Join Sam's Club for $45 and get a $45 gift card. Visit
were both published in Latin. Sir Thomas More wrote Utopia in Latin. William Harvey wrote his Treatise on the Circulation of Blood, written in 1616, the year of Shakespeare's death, in Latin. Edward Gibbon wrote his histories in French and then translated them into English. As Bow and Cable note, the use of English for purposes of scholarship was frankly experimental. Moreover, in Shakespeare's day, English had yet to conquer the whole of the British Isles. It was the language of England and lowland Scotland, but it had barely penetrated into Wales, Ireland, and the Scottish Highlands and Islands, and would not for some time. As recently as the last century, Britain was able to elect a prime minister whose native tongue was not English, to wit, the Welsh-speaking David Lloyd George. In 1582, the scholar Richard Mulcaster noted glumly, "The English tongue is of small account, stretching no further than this island of ours, nay, not there over all." He had no way of knowing that within less than a generation, English would be transported to the New World, where it would begin its inexorable rise to becoming the foremost language of the world. Chapter 5. Where Words Come From. If you have a morbid fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of your mouth, there is a word for it, arachnobutyrophobia. There is a word to describe the state of being a woman, muliebrity. And there's a word for describing a sudden breaking off of thought, aposiopesis. If you harbor an urge to look through the windows of the homes you pass, there is a word for the condition, critoscopophilia. When you're just dropped rocking off to sleep and you experience that sudden sensation of falling, there is a word for it. It's a myoclonic jerk. If you want to say that a word has a circumflex in its penultimate syllable without saying flat out that it has a circumflex there is a word for it. Properis promenon. There is even a word for a figure of speech in which two connotative words linked by a conjunction express a complex notion that would normally be conveyed by an adjective and a substantive working together. It is a hendiatus. But of course, in English, in short, there are words for almost everything. Some of these words deserve to be better known. Take velleity, which describes a mild desire, a wish or urge too slight to lead to action. Doesn't that seem a useful term? Or how about slubberdigullion, a 17th century word signifying a worthless or slovenly fellow? Or ugsome, a late medieval word meaning loathsome or disgusting. It has lasted half a millennium in English, was a common synonym for horrid until well into the 19th century, and can still be found tucked away forgotten at the back of most unabridged dictionaries. Isn't it a shame to let it slip away? Our dictionaries are full of such words, words describing the most specific of conditions, the most improbable of contingencies, the most arcane of distinctions. And yet there are odd gaps. We have no word for coolness corresponding to warmth. We are strangely lacking in middling terms, words to describe with some precision the middle ground between hard and soft, near and far, big and little. We have a possessive impersonal pronoun its to place alongside his, her, and their, but no equivalent impersonal pronoun to contrast with the personal whose. Thus we have to rely on inelegant constructions such as the house whose roof, or resort to periphrasis. We have a word to describe all the work you find waiting for you when you return from vacation, backlog, but none to describe all the work you have to do before you go. Why not forelog? And we have a large number of negative words, inept, disheveled, incorrigible, ruthless, unkempt, for which the positive form is missing. English would be richer if we could say admiringly of a tidy person, she's so shoveled, or praise a capable person for being full of ept, or an energetic one for having heaps of ert. Many of these words did once have positive forms. Ruthless was companioned by ruth, meaning compassion. One of Milton's poems contains the well-known line, "Look homeward, angel, now, and melt with ruth." But as with many such words, one form died and another lived. Why this should be is beyond explanation. Why should we have lost demit, send away, but saved commit? Why should impede have survived while the once equally common and seemingly just as useful expede expired? No one can say. Despite these gaps and casualties, English retains probably the richest vocabulary, the most diverse shading of meanings of any language. We can distinguish between house and home, as, for instance, the French cannot, between continual and continuous, sensual and sensuous, forceful and forcible, childish and childlike, masterful and masterly, assignment and assignation, informant and informer. For almost every word we have a multiplicity of synonyms. Something is not just big, it is large, immense, vast, capacious, bulky, massive, whopping, humongous. No other language has so many words all saying the same thing. It has been said that English is unique in possessing a synonym for each level of our culture, popular, literary, and scholarly, so that we can, according to our background and cerebral attainments, rise, mount, or ascend a stairway, shrink in fear, terror, or trepidation, and think, ponder, or cogitate upon a problem. This abundance of terms is often cited as a virtue, and yet a critic could equally argue that English is an untidy and acquisitive language, cluttered with a plethora of needless words. art of fine vocabulary. There is something in that. A rich vocabulary carries with it a concomitant danger of verbosity, as evidenced by our peculiar affection for redundant phrases, expressions that say the same thing twice: beck and call, law and order, assault and battery, null and void, safe and sound, first and foremost, trials and tribulations, hem and haw, spick and span, kith and kin, dig and delve, hale and hearty, peace and quiet, vim and vigor, pots and pans, cease and desist, rack and ruin, without let or hindrance, to all intents and purposes, various, different. Despite this bounty of terms, we have a strange, and to foreigners it must seem maddening, tendency to load a single word with a whole galaxy of meanings. Fine, for instance, has 14 definitions as an adjective, 6 as a noun, and 2 as an adverb. In the Oxford English Dictionary, it fills 2 full pages and takes 5,000 words of description. We can talk about fine art, fine gold, a fine edge, peeling fine, fine hair, and a court fine, and mean quite separate things. The condition of having many meanings is known as polysemy, and it is very common. Sound is another polysemic word. Its vast repertory of meanings can suggest an audible noise, a state of healthiness, sound mind, an outburst, sound off, an inquiry, sound out, a body of water, Puget Sound, or financial stability, sound economy, among many others. And then there's round. In the OED, round alone, that is, without variants like rounded and round up, takes 7.5 pages to define, or about 15,000 words of text, about as much as is contained in the first 100 pages of this book. Even when you strip out its obsolete senses, round still has 12 uses as an adjective, 19 as a noun, 7 as a transitive verb, 5 as an intransitive verb, 1 as an adverb, and 2 as a preposition. But the polysemic champion must be set. Superficially, it looks like a wholly unseeming monosyllable, the verbal equivalent of the single-celled organism. Yet it has 58 uses as a noun, 126 as a verb, and 10 as a participial adjective. Its meanings are so various and scattered that it takes the OED 60,000 words, the length of a short novel, to discuss them all. A foreigner could be excused for thinking that to know set is to know English. Generally, polysemy happens because one word sprouts a variety of meanings, but sometimes it is the other way around. Similar but quite separate words evolve identical spelling. Boil in the sense of heating a pan of water, and boil in the sense of an eruption of the skin, are 2 unrelated words that simply happen to be spelled the same way. So are policy in the sense of a strategy or a plan, and the policy in a life insurance policy. Excise, meaning to cut, is quite distinct in origin from excise in the sense of a customs duty. Sometimes, just to heighten the confusion, the same word ends up with contradictory meanings. This kind of word is called a contronym. Sanction, for instance, can either signify permission to do something or a measure forbidding it to be done. Cleave can mean cut in half or stick together. A sanguine person is either hot-headed and bloodthirsty or calm and cheerful. Something that is fast is either stuck firmly or moving quickly. A door that is bolted is secure, but a horse that has bolted has taken off. If you wind up a meeting, you finish it. If you wind up a watch, you start it. To ravish means to rape